This is an informational speech on fermentation, the science and the abundance. Before we get into it, I want to share the basic books that I heavily relied on. The Art of Fermentation by Sandor Katz. I don't think that I could recommend a better reference to the subject than this. This is something that I refer to constantly. The Noma Guide to Fermentation is more of a experimental book, but it does have a good basic introduction, and I do highly recommend their take on fermentation. If you don't feel like doing a bunch of crazy stuff, maybe rent this one from a library. The Oxford Companion to Beer is the Bible and largest tome of beer fermentation that exists. Really awesome book, edited by Garrett Oliver, one of the best brewers in the country. This is a little more fun, but still a great book. Adam Rogers' Proof, The Science of Booze. Really good kind of general primer for a general audience. So, I said this is called Fermentation, the Science and the Abundance. I basically want to spread awareness of what fermentation is and how it affects us. Fermentation is a part of our daily lives, yet many of us do not understand the basic science around it, and I feel many people are even ignorant of how much food is fermented. So what is fermentation? Why is it important? And how do we interact with it? So fermentation, the word itself is based off the Latin fever, which means to boil, referring to the carbon dioxide release in brewing beer, from the Oxford Companion to Beer. The actual science of it is fermentation is when microorganisms, yeasts, bacteria, or fungi transform a food substance into something else. So they convert sugar, multiple types of sugars, into another substance. They metabolize it in an anaerobic environment, an oxygenless environment. So you have multiple types of bacteria, multiple types of yeast, and multiple types of fungi that on a microbial level change foodstuffs through metabolizing sugars into either acids or alcohols, and we call that fermentation. There are a few different types or styles of fermentation. There's probably hundreds, but we'll touch upon three basics that are kind of really broad, big families. The first one is going to be considering the lactobacillus bacteria, lactic acid bacteria. We call them LAB bacteria, lab bacteria in general, so you don't have to say all that all the time. But basically, they turn sugar into lactic acid. The next method involves yeast, and this is probably the one that is most popular with people. They turn sugar into alcohols and carbon dioxide. Yeast, so the same as the word fermentation is from fever in Latin, meaning to boil. The word yeast is from Greek zestos, also meaning to boil. Again, referring to the carbon dioxide release while brewing beer. Beer brewing has been important in human culture. it would seem. The third type involves, so we've touched upon bacterial fermentation and yeast fermentation. The third type is the combination of both bacterial and yeast fermentation. The yeast ferment sugars into alcohol, and then a new group of bacteria, not lactobacterias, but acetic acid bacterias, transform the alcohol into acetic acid. It's kind of a secondary fermentation. The yeast has fermented sugars to alcohol. The acetic acid bacteria ferment alcohol into acetic acid. Those are kind of the three broad groups. I hope I haven't glossed over them too quickly. There's one group that produces lactic acid, another group that produces alcohol, and another group that produces acetic acid. Okay. What kind of foods does this produce? Lab bacteria foods, lactic acid bacteria foods. These are probably when people say fermentation, this is probably what most people think of. Sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, sour cream, kefir, any and all pickles, any vegetable, any fruit that you want to pickle is a lacto-fermented process. It needs an anaerobic environment, so oxygenless. The second type is the yeast ferment, which we all know and love, produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Beer, wine, mead, spirits, all of that is done by yeast converting the sugars into alcohol. That is fermentation. Humans have decided that Saccharomyces cerevisiae, a species of yeast out of thousands, is the one that we have chosen to do all of our alcohol and all of our bread. It's not the only one, but it is by and far the most prevalent. So sourdough bread, any bread involving yeast is usually Saccharomyces cerevisiae. All of our alcohol is usually that as well. There are open ferment beers that use wild yeast, but generally speaking, that is the strain or species of yeast that we have chosen. Depending on what temperature you ferment at or brew at, the different strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae will be at the top or a bottom of your ferment pool. The top is ales, which is almost every type of beer you can think of, and then the bottom is lagers. So think like Budweiser, Miller, Coors, that kind of thing. Breads are pretty much the same process. Making bread is almost the first step of making beer, wine, or alcohol. You just cook it in the oven. The third type is the bacteria yeast combo that I mentioned. And these are going to be your vinegars, your kombuchas. So you have the yeast convert the sugars to alcohol, and then acetic acid bacterias, AAB bacterias, unlike the lab bacterias, AAB bacterias, acetic acid bacteria converts alcohol into acetic acid. This will give you vinegar. This fermentation type, unlike the previous two, requires oxygen. It's aerobic metabolism, not anaerobic metabolism. It requires oxygen. Vinegars are really old and really common, also indicating that alcohol fermentation, yeast fermentation, is also old and common, because before you get vinegar, you need alcohol. And then we have a fourth type, which involves all three: the lacto-fermentation, the yeast fermentation, the yeast bacteria fermentation, making vinegars, acetic acid bacteria, And all of those come together to form a completely new group of foods that you all probably know and love: coffee, chocolate, vanilla bean. A lot of people think they don't know or are surprised to hear that coffee and chocolate are fermented foods. And not only are they fermented foods, but they involve all three groups of fermentation to become the product that we know and love. They are beans. All three of those are beans, and essentially, the fruit, the bean, falls to the ground, and they are fermented in big heaps. Some of the more tightly packed, oxygenless portions that are packed down are going to be lacto-fermented, oxygenless, and the ones that are open to oxygen will be fermented by acetic acid bacteria like vinegars. And after the process is done, generally 1 to 2 weeks, the flavors of coffee and chocolate that we think of as coffee and chocolate have developed and are ready to be processed, dried, roasted, and shipped to us. But yeah, coffee, chocolate, and vanilla beans are all fermented products. So I've touched briefly on basically saying that all these we're encouraging bacterial growth. A lot of people in our modern lifestyle say, why would we encourage bacterial growth at room temperature outside of refrigeration for months on end? That seems really dangerous. What's the safety of this? How safe is fermented foods? Sandor Katz says rapid proliferation of acidifying bacteria, that's the good stuff, makes it almost impossible for pathogenic organisms to establish themselves. It's one of the safest and oldest of food preparation methods. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization report says the lactic acid meaning the lactic acid bacteria, the lactic acid they produce is effective in inhibiting the growth of other bacteria that may decompose or spoil the food. Lactic acid fermentation is an effective strategy for food preservation and safety. Think about what we use as natural cleaners. Alcohol, a fermented product, is a natural disinfectant. Vinegar, including the yeast fermentation and the acetic acid fermentation, vinegar is a natural disinfectant. That's why we use vinegar as a household cleaner. It is understandable in our modern world that people are kind of afraid of saying, hey, chop up a bunch of cabbage and leave it out at room temperature for 6 months. Don't worry, it'll be fine. So what are people most scared of? I think there's been something looming in our culture for a long time, and that's botulism. Botulism is a bacteria, just like the bacteria that ferment the foods, but it is bad. It is most common in unfermented, low-acid, canned or jarred foods. So really, when you're fermenting foods, you don't really have to worry about botulism because the acids that are created are so high that it kills the botulism. But botulism is bad. It is the most toxic substance known to humankind. It is fatal at 1/1,000,000th of a gram per kilogram of body weight. Nothing else comes close to that. Again, it is most common. It's not common anymore, but it's most common in low acid canned or jarred food. If you ever see your canned or jarred food with a bubble or a pop top, don't eat that. That's a good indication that the botulism bacteria has been giving off gas by reproducing. So why does fermentation inhibit botulism? So fermentation, in its nature, is a low pH or a high acid environment. It kills botulism. Botulism does not live in a acidic environment. We'll talk briefly about the pH scale soon. Salting, using salt, is also important in the fermentation process when you're talking about lacto-fermentation. A general rule is 2% salt by weight of whatever it is you're fermenting. Most bacteria do not do well in a saline environment. So a salty environment kills almost everything. That's why you can like cure meat with salt. It kills almost all bacteria. Except lactobacteria, the good stuff that you want, are salt friendly. They are fine. So 2% salt by weight in your ferment. So you got 20 pounds of cabbage, you put 2% of salt in there and you're fine. It will encourage the lactobacteria to ferment and nothing else will be able to survive in the saline environment. That's for flavor and also just a safeguard. But on top of that, the fermentation process creates a very, very low pH, meaning high acid. So the pH scale is another thing. Probably it sounds too scientific to get into, but it really isn't. The pH scale goes from 0 to 14. 7 is the middle, that's neutral. 7 is tap water. It is neutral. It's neither acidic nor alkaline. 0 to 7 is acidic. 7 to 14 is alkaline. Fermented foods are generally below 4%, 4 on the pH scale, and that will completely kill any pathogenic bacteria. So it really is by nature, by itself, it is a very safe inherent process. So to refocus, the broad idea of fermentation is the transformation of food, more food than we really think about, by microorganisms, yeasts, bacteria, molds, fungi, by converting sugars into other substances, mostly acids or alcohols. It transforms flavor, it preserves food, and it also makes foods safer by killing any pathogenic bacteria that was present in the first place. Sandor Katz notes that as much as 1/3 of our food, 33% of our food that we consume is fermented. Again, pickles, bread, cheese, yogurt, sour cream, kefir, vinegars, soy sauce, miso, kombucha, all alcohol, beer, wine, chocolate, coffee, and countless other things are fermented. I think it's really important to remember that this is not a human invention or something that we discovered. It is a natural process that humans along the way have co-evolved and been a cultivator of fermentation. In our modern commercial scale food production, we have lost touch with this seemingly alien food preparation method, but in fact, in our daily life, again, if you eat yogurt or cheese or drink coffee or drink beer, or eat bread, you are eating fermented foods. Sandor Katz says, quote, "There is a tremendous fear in our culture of aging food outside of refrigeration." I can definitely sympathize with that, and I hope that the brief information that I've provided just now helps you tamp down some of those fears, but also I hope it has been informative enough to the point where there is a world of information out there Again, I would highly refer you to The Art of Fermentation by Sandor Katz, and get more information on this. If you like hot sauce, you're probably eating fermented foods. If you're eating sauerkraut, you know you're eating fermented foods. Vinegars, everybody uses vinegar. It's in more things that you know about. It's fermented. So grab a bar of chocolate, or a cup of coffee, or take a bite of cheese, or crack open a beer. Take a swig and say, fermentation is delicious. There really is a world of knowledge out there, and again, I would refer you to Sandor Katz and the Noma Guide to Fermentation. Cheers.